Man, oh man, what a day.
Hunter McDavid, Draisaitl scores!
Pasternak, Marchand, he'll drag it right in for a chance.
Holy mackerel, what a save! Made by Marc-Andre Fleury!
Unbelievable by Austin Matthews. A complete turnaround.
We're going to Boston, baby!
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another Fantasy Hockey Books episode. Wow. NHL free agency just opening yesterday. Tons of signings. Let's get into it. So I'm your host here, Antonio Capos. I'm with Ben Rutledge. How are you doing, buddy?
I'm doing good. Just want to say welcome back. Month off, but I'm back and ready to go. Just for everyone listening, this is like an emergency episode. We're only covering July 28th signings. Anything that happened on that day of fantasy relevance we'll talk about. And we have our usual Friday episode coming out on Friday with everything else, trades, other days signings, and stuff leading up to it, like the NHL draft.
All right. So starting us off, Tyson Barrie re-signs with the Oilers for 3 years at $13.5 million total, which I think it works out to like 3.45, right?
Something around that, yeah. Or no, it's like 5 something. No, sorry, not 5. It's like 4. Gosh, we're bad at math. It's like 4.3 or something, 4.4.
All right. I think his value is going to stay similar because if not increase, because their defense has taken a downgrade this offseason. Oilers brought in the vet Duncan Keith, but they got rid of players like Ethan Bear. Their defense is looking like Chris Russell. Clefbaum's out this year. Adam Larson's gone to Seattle. Looking really rough for them this year.
He's going to get a ton of minutes, and obviously his defensive woes don't really matter to you in fantasy. I think he's still actually a very solid fantasy player just because he's going to be playing with McDavid and Draisaitl and on that power play. So he's obviously, I think he's still a top 70 player and really a defenseman too, probably. He shouldn't be your number one defenseman unless you have like 3 defenseman twos. But he'll still have a ton of upside staying with Edmonton, staying with McDavid. And I expect a very similar year from him to the one he had last year.
All right, moving on. Alec Martinez re-signs with Vegas for 3 years.
5.25 per. My opinion, good signing for Vegas. Good landing spot for his fantasy value. Expect another top 150 season from him. Same as Barrie. Really expect the same thing from him. Wouldn't expect that to change. Yeah.
And sorry, just cutting back a little bit here. I know we didn't talk about Gabriel Landeskog in our last episode because obviously our last episode was before his signing, but he re-signs with the Avalanche 8 years.
7 mil per 56 total. Yeah, that happened like on the 11:30 on the 27th.
Right. So it's basically in this episode. I think his value stays literally the same as the Avalanche. Nothing much has changed except for their star goaltender leaving. But that shouldn't affect his fantasy value much.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Next up, Antti Ranta. Signs 2 years, 2 mil average.
Ranta's, if you actually look at his pure stats, has been a terrific goalie the last 3 years, but starts like 9 games because he's always hurt. And I think Carolina, as much as they've definitely gotten worse, they still have an amazing defense core. And Freddie's obviously still a big question mark. Like, I wouldn't consider him the lock for the Carolina starter at the end of the season. And so I think Antti Ranta really has potential to steal the net if he can stay healthy.
Yeah, but then again, if you're going to be drafting this guy, I think he's going to be your last pick in the draft. Not much more than that, or your guy that you pick up off waivers. if there's an injury, or just if you are feeling weak at goalie.
He does have a ton of potential, but not a ton of, but a pretty poor floor.
Right. Moving on, Ryan Sutter goes to Dallas. I think this is actually a downgrade because he's going to be getting less minutes behind Klingberg and Heiskanen.
I agree, and he won't be playing a power play at all like he was in Minnesota. So
Right.
I expect him to kind of head towards. He was already a fringe ownable player, and I think he's kind of just a waiver wire player at this point.
Yeah, definitely. Moving on, Peter Mrazek signs the Leafs.
3 years.
They kind of needed somebody to back up Campbell, just in case last year was, with the small sample size, was a little bit of a fluke. But obviously, without Freddie, they didn't have that anymore. So it makes sense that they signed Mrazek.
I also don't think that this is a guaranteed backup signing, as Campbell was really a backup before last year, and he really came onto the scene strong. And I think that there still are some question marks. Obviously, I love Campbell as a Leafs fan, love the guy. But I do think there are still question marks. And Mrazek's a very solid backup and proven to be a very good fantasy player, like a very good fantasy goalie, excuse me. And so I think that he still does have that possible value. And the Leafs obviously signed him for 3.8 mil. So they're not necessarily signing him straight as a backup. And I expect them to kind of go 60-40. And so Mrazek does have some potential. And in the post that we did, I mentioned how he can get on some really hot streaks where he might start 5 or 6 games in a row and let in like 3 goals, 4 goals in that streak. And so him somewhat similar to Ranta, maybe a bit earlier, late teen round pickup, I think, and has a ton of potential. But his floor, he does actually have a decent-ish floor, unlike Ranta.
Right. Moving on, Alex Wenberg signs with Seattle. He's likely going to be a top 6 center for them, making $4.5 million.
I think for Seattle, this is an overpay. Obviously, good for Wenberg. But I think for fantasy, I just don't see where he's going to get any value from. If you look up and down the Seattle lineup, after that first line of Likely, McCann, Gord,
yeah.
something like that. After that, they really don't have much. And so
they have Eberle. Don't sleep on Eberle.
But still, they don't have that much else. And so he hasn't been too relevant, and I don't expect that to be, but he is someone to watch. As obviously,
yeah, I could see him take a step and be like a William Karlsson type player who, was a second line on the second, third liner on the team before, comes to an expansion franchise and, pops off.
Yeah, so he definitely is someone to watch. All right, and next, Blake Coleman signs a huge contract, 6 years, $4.9 million per. I also mentioned this in our post. Coleman wasn't that relevant last year. He obviously will be playing more minutes. But as I said, a direct quote from the post, if he isn't playing with 2 of Tkachuk, Lindholm, Monahan, and Goudreau, he isn't too relevant. I could see him be a Zach Hyman type of player with 2 of those. He just doesn't have enough skill to drive his own line and create his own points.
All right, moving on. Frederik Andersen, we talked about him a little bit already. He went to the Canes. Looks like he'll either be playing in a tandem or as the starter with Antti Ranta. Obviously, I think he has a little bit more value than Ranta because obviously he has that experience as a seasoned starter. Being the starter with Toronto and Anaheim before that. And actually having a couple, elite looking seasons with Toronto a couple of years back. So you could look for him to have a bounce back season this year. Otherwise, Ranta's a solid backup pickup.
Yeah, I think Freddie's kind of a tier 6 goalie, kind of just outside that top 150 range. I think he'll be going into a very similar situation with a good but not great defensive team. Actually, Toronto was pretty good defensively last year, but Carolina will be kind of a good, not great defensive team. And so they will give up chances. And Freddie's shown flashes of being elite, but I don't know what he's really got left at 32 or 33 years old. And so he is someone that you should draft, but don't be necessarily expecting goalie number one numbers from him.
Right. Moving on, Zach Hyman. We just talked about him. Signed 7 years, 5.5 with the Edmonton Oilers. Obviously, I think he's going to end up having similar, if not slightly better, value to what he had with the Leafs, just as he's going to be playing with one of McDavid and Draisaitl. And when you play with either of those guys, you're going to be making, those guys are getting 1 or 2 points a game. So if you're on the ice with them, you're probably going to be, getting a secondary assist or a tap in goal. So you'll be getting a point probably, just under a point per game.
Yeah. It's worth noting that he does have an injury history with his knees, especially. So that's just something to watch for. All right. So the next signing, Yaroslav Halak signs 2 years, 1.5 with the Vancouver Canucks. This is just a backup signing. Somewhat similar to Ranta. He's shown good numbers before, but the Canucks are a pretty poor defensive team. Mostly we're mentioning because Demko isn't necessarily going to be the true number one. They signed him like he is, but he may not be. So Halak might get some starts in there, and he just is someone to watch because I expect the bounce back year from the Canucks.
Right, and it's important to note, we've been skipping a decent amount of people, and that's just because anybody that we don't cover they are like basically fantasy irrelevant. Like anybody with a sliver of relevance, like Halak, we just talked about, we will talk about. But if we don't talk about them, I would advise against picking them up in your league, even if you have injuries.
Such as Derek Forbort, David Savard, Zach Bogosian, just looking at it here, those three. I wouldn't really advise picking up any three of those because they don't really hold any value. Savard possibly in a Bangos league, but other than that, those are just team signings, not relevant to fantasy. All right, so the next signing is Mikael Granlund signs 4 years, 20 mil, 5 per with the Nashville Predators. I think his value stay the same, just above that waiver wire position. I think we say his value kind of decreases in that the teams that he was rumored to go to is Toronto heavily. There was a ton of potential there, likely to play with Marner and Matthews. Obviously, that's gone, re-signing with Nashville. And so his value technically stays the same, but his possible value decreases a ton. And so he's just kind of a late round pickup. Hopefully he develops. And now his contract's at the point where it's really untradeable to a team who's on the cusp, just because it's such a big contract for so many years. So Granlund's likely to be not too relevant unless Nashville makes some big moves.
Right. Moving on, Braden Holtby signs with the Dallas Stars, 1 year, 2 mil. I think this is just going to be like a kind of, between goalies kind of signing. Bishop isn't exactly in his prime, not playing. I don't think he played any games last year, right? He was injured. Yeah. And they don't really have a rookie goalie coming up.
They have Ottinger, who played games last year, and Anton Khudobin, who played games. So there's 4 legit goalies on that roster. And I mentioned this in the post. It's Braden Holtby. He has the potential to be really good. And so that's why he's worth mentioning. If he steals the net on a good defensive team like Dallas, if he's able to steal the net, he's probably worth owning. I wouldn't necessarily draft him, but I would watch list him right from the start of the year and just see how it goes. Because I think when he starts, if he showed flashes with Vancouver last year that he still has it. And if he does that, I think he is fantasy relevant.
Right. And I think that Dallas is kind of starting to give up on Bishop a little bit. He's getting, less and less playing time. He's getting older, injuries. And obviously Khudobin was their starter last year. the main starter, but he's also getting older. I think he's going to be 36 this year. So just watch for the tandem to be Odinger and Holtby this year, with a kind of like a shared percentage.
Yeah. All right. So the next signing is the Toronto Maple Leafs sign Michael Bunting, 2 years, $950,000 per year. I love this signing as a Leafs fan. 950,000. You can bury that in the AHL if he sucks. I doubt that though. I think he'll at worst be a fourth liner. He obviously had 10 goals in 21 games with the Coyotes last year. And his advanced analytics graph was the exact same as Craig Smith's from last year. So that's just interesting. Craig Smith was a great fantasy player down the stretch for you. He's familiar with Cal Dubas. He's familiar with Sheldon Keefe, played with them in Sault Ste. Marie, or played for them in Sault Ste. Marie. He's a left winger. He has potential to go on that top line. Not saying he will, but he does with Marner and Matthews. If he does, immediate must waiver or must pick up player. And he showed some flashes last year in the NHL. And
yeah, I really think his upside is going to be around like Zach Hyman, prime Zach Hyman with the Leafs when Matthews and Marner were at full output during the year.
I agree. If he isn't there, so that's why I'd say in your draft him with your last pick. You can always drop him if he just ends up not being on that top line. But if you're getting a guy in the last round who's playing with Mitchell Marner and Austin Matthews, that's pretty good value to me.
Yeah, definitely. Moving on, Ryan Getzlaf re-signs with the Ducks. The main thing of relevance there, I think he's normally like, one of the more like lower last center on your team kind of players. Normally, I think the main news there is that he didn't sign with a team like Boston or LA or somewhere where he could have gotten reps with more elite players, like a Taylor Hall or possibly like a Anze Kopitar. So yeah, I think he remains pretty much the same, aside from obviously the factor that he's aging. So he's going to be obviously a little bit worse next year.
All right, so moving on to the next signing, Andreas Athanasiou signs 1 year, $2.7 million with the Los Angeles Kings. He's listed as a center on NHL.com, although I expect him to be likely a winger on that second line, the Deneau line. Him and Iafallo likely, something like that. I don't think there's a ton of value there, but he does have a ton of skill. That is a ton of talent that is worth noting. And he was irrelevant last year, but was kind of relevant early in his career on the Wings. And then he was relevant down the stretch 2 years ago on the Oilers. And so I think it's just worth noting that he could be relevant. Wouldn't draft him, but he's just worth noting.
Right. Moving on, we have Carter Verhaeghe re-signing with Florida. Obviously, he had a great year last year, came out of nowhere. I think he was buried down the depth chart in Tampa. But he signs a 3-year extension. The details of how much he's making haven't been released yet. However, I think he's a very rosterable player. He's kind of your like he's a weak center 2 or like a good value center 3 on your team, / flex type player. So yeah. I'd be taking him around
50, around 13 or so, around 14.
Yes. Yeah, somewhere around there, depending on obviously how many teams are in your league. But yeah, he's just a very solid player. I don't expect him to do quite as well as he did last year because that was just kind of a breakout out of nowhere season. But I wouldn't be surprised if he did something similar.
Yeah, I agree. So the next signing is Philip Grubauer, signs 6 years, $5.9 million with the Seattle Kraken.
Wow.
That is not where I expect him to go. He loses a lot of value, a lot of win totals down. I think if you're in a heavy shots league where saves matter a ton, he could be valuable because I think he will be facing a lot of saves, and he obviously still is a good goaltender. It's just with that win potential way down. He drops way down the depth chart out of a tier 1/2 goalie, closer to tier 4 goalie, I think, around there.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, if you're doing a keeper league and you kept him already, that's very much unfortunate for you. Otherwise, for all those, he's probably outside the top 100 now. He's lost a ton of value now.
Yeah, definitely. Moving on, I think the next one we have here is Philip Deneau. We've already talked about him a little bit. He signed 6 years with LA. LA trying to make, I think they're going to make a run this year. The West's kind of weak. I could see them making out of the first round. With the additions of Ardbison, good defensive center and Deneau playing behind Anze Kopitar. So now they have more than just one line. I could see them doing things over in the West. Making moves, just like the Blackhawks have been trying to do for the last 3 years.
All right, so the next signing is Jaden Schwartz signs 5 years, $5.5 million with the Seattle Kraken. I think for his value, this is a boost. He kind of jumps into that just fringe top 100 player. I think he has a ton of potential playing with Gord and McCann. I think that it may be a bit of an overpay, but good for Seattle. They needed a guy like him, just like a solid NHL player who can help drive a line. And I think that his value is tremendously boosted from playing on that second line in St. Louis. And he's very worth a 11th, 10th round pick type thing, maybe 9th.
Yeah, and I think it's always important to be comparing the Vegas moves with Seattle, just because they're both obviously the most recent expansion franchises. Vegas is just 4 years old now. But I think the main comparable here is that Schwartz might turn into somebody like a Jonathan Marchessault, who I don't expect him to be putting up 30 goals a year, but it's not out of the question. Because their team is just so weak right now. And, you need to get goals somewhere. I doubt that they'll turn into a Detroit or Buffalo right away. Just based on the fact that they have decent pieces now.
Mm-hmm. All right. So the next signing is Eric Holla signs 2 years, 4.75 total.
Which I think it's 2.35 a year, 2.45 a year.
Yeah, it is with the Boston Bruins.
I think based on the fact that Krejci is now retiring and going to play in Czech, this is actually a big increase to his value, as he's going to be playing on that second line, likely with Hall and Craig Smith, who were very productive in their games with Boston last year. Kind of unfortunate because it seemed that line of Hall, Krejci, and Craig Smith was getting some chemistry during the end of the year in playoffs. However, we're going to have to wait to see how Hall plays that line. It looks like Hall is back to playing as a solid top 6 piece. So just being on the line with him and somebody who's popping off as much as Craig Smith at the end of the year last year is just valuable. So I think he's probably going to be in that 100 to 110 range, 120 maybe. I wouldn't draft him quite that high. I'd probably draft him. I'd wait on him just because I'd want to see what he does before I pick him up. But yeah, I don't think he's any higher than really a 100 type player.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, so the next signing is Alex Edler signs 1 year, $3.5 million with the Los Angeles Kings. Worth noting, he was relevant 2 years ago. After Doughty, they don't really have a second power play defenseman likely to be him. He doesn't take penalties if penalties are negatives in your league. He is kind of old, but it's just still worth noting that he does have maybe some very late round potential. But
well, especially if you're in a Bangos league with blocks and he's worthless if you're in a points league. Absolutely worthless. Don't pick him up, period. But if if you're in a Bangos league, this guy gets blocks, he gets hits. He can be valuable.
All right, so the next signing is Anthony D'Angelo signs 1 year, $1 million with the Carolina Hurricanes. I think D'Angelo showed that he was a terrific defenseman. 2 years ago, he was elite of elite for fantasy defenseman. Obviously, he ran into off-ice troubles. I think if he can keep those straight, he'll probably run power play one for Carolina. Means he's playing with Aho, Teravainen, and Svechnikov. Like those are some elite players he's playing with. And so I would not be surprised if he went there and just became the same elite defenseman he was with the Rangers. However, if he continues those off-ice struggles, I do expect him to be worthless as he has been before.
Moving on, our next signing is a re-signing. Braden Point gets paid 8 years, 9.5. Crazy, man. I think obviously Tampa was already over the cap at the end in this offseason, as has been a popular topic. And so they're going to be losing a lot of pieces. However, Braden Point's just Braden Point. He's an elite player. Whoever he plays with, he's going to get points.
It's important to note he does have 1 year left on his $6.5 million contract. This contract starts next year. It's just a classic Tampa Bay thing to do, get him done before the year starts.
Right. Anyway, he's still going to be playing with Kucherov likely, and depending, maybe Stamkos, if they stick Stamkos on that wing. I doubt they will. I think they're going to go back to 2 lines for the regular season. But yeah, just a really solid player. Obviously, I think he's definitely going to be in your top 50 players. He's going to be your even higher than that. Probably he's going to be your center one in any kind of league, unless it's a 10-team league where he might drop to center 2. But I think he's going to be your center one.
Yeah. Matthias Janmark signs 1 year, $2 million, re-signs with the Vegas Golden Knights. I think he did pretty well. He didn't have the point production people were necessarily hoping for when Vegas got him at the deadline. I think he does have potential to maybe sneak into one of the top 6. It might be hard. If he sneaks in the top 6, he's probably a top 200 player. Otherwise, more of a waiver player, but he is as well just someone to watch.
Right, and I think the first thing that comes to mind for me when I think Janmark is that he had a hat trick in Game 7 for Vegas against Minnesota, pushing them to the conference finals against the Habs. If he's able to do that in the regular season at all, he's going to have value to you as somebody that is just valuable every now and then, pops off for a couple of games here and there. Just a streaky player like that.
Yeah. So the next signing is Nick Foligno, signs 2 years, $3.8 million with the Boston Bruins.
Right. I really like his value now, judging on the fact that they're going to be probably shuffling who's in that middle 6, like on the second and third line. A lock on the second line is Hall. So if Foligno was to play with Hall, his value is going to increase. If there's an injury on the first line for the Bruins, I think Foligno is going to be their kind of handyman. He jumps all around the lineup, and I could see him playing on that first line, getting some points. Just because of the fact that Bergeron went out and recruited him personally to the team. So I think you can watch for him to be all around the lineup. If he's playing in that top 6, roster him. Otherwise, I think he's going to be irrelevant this year again.
It's funny because this is the first time where we've really had a differing opinion. I think Foligno's done. He really wasn't the same player last year in Columbus. He came to the Leafs. He played with Matthews and Marner, and Matthews scored 5 goals in the last 7 games, and Foligno had 3 points or 4 points. None of them goals. He was hurt most of the playoffs. He played, but he was hurt most of the playoffs. I think Foligno's really done at this point. I think it was an overpay, especially that second year is going to be brutal for the Bruins, I think. Luckily, it is only 2 years, so you can eat 3.8 for 1 year. But I just think regardless, even if he plays on the second line, I still think that he's just kind of done. And so to me, he's a waiver player to possibly watch because he still obviously can be streaky, but that's just my opinion.
Wow, our first differ. All right, you'll have to judge for yourself between our two opinions. The analyst or the player. We'll see what happens during the year. Moving on.
Mike Hoffman signs 3 years, 4.4 and change with the Montreal Canadiens. I think that this is this is a good potential landing spot for him, especially with Weber leaving. He has the opportunity for 15 plus power play goals, which automatically makes anyone ownable. And I think he's a 18th round, 19th round draft pick. That you pick him, hope that he does well in the power play and is able to score a couple even strength. You can get up around that 30 goal plateau. I think if he does that, solid season for you, solid 19th round value. That's just my opinion.
And I think it's important to note that the Habs have been terrible on the power play. I mean, terrible the last 2 years. So adding this piece to their team is going to be really helpful, especially because he might be, they might run a 5 forward power play with Weber getting injured and have him quarterbacking it. So yeah, just generally a good piece to have.
All right, so the next signing is Linus Ullmark, signs 4 years, $5 million per with the Boston Bruins.
Yeah, and it looks like he's going to be running a tandem with Swayman, just because I think Swayman's not proven, but obviously in the small sample size we had of him last year, he was like an almost elite level goalie with like a .920 save percentage, winning 4 of the 5 games he played. However, obviously 5 games isn't enough to judge a player by, so that they'll bring in Ullmark to take the majority of the reps this year, I believe. And since Boston has been building, and I think they're a decent contender this year. And just based off wins, I think he has decent value.
Yeah, I agree. Next signing is Alexander Texier, re-signs 2 years, 1.6 or so, 1.56, I think, something like that. With the Columbus Blue Jackets, I think there was potential and still is, especially with Foligno gone, for Texier to take over that number 1 center. Might be a bit harder with Roslovic the way he played, but I think Texier still has potential. And if he does that, playing with Voracek and Laine, I think he has potential to be ownable, just someone to watch. I think his value probably decreases just because he could have gone somewhere else and been a bit more effective, especially at that price range. But yeah, he wasn't really that relevant last year, and I expect some of the same unless he ends up on that top line. Excuse me.
Right. Moving on to Dougie Hamilton, he signs with New Jersey. He gets paid to 7 years at 9. I think he has $9 million, right? Or is it 9.5?
Yeah. $9 million per year.
Right. Solid for him, I guess. I think his value takes a big dip. Obviously, he's been injured quite a lot over the last 2 years. But I think, his projected value for a while now has been a top 10 defenseman. And I think now he will have a chance to be that guy, just because he's going to get so many minutes for New Jersey. But, that team, it's up and coming. But right now, it's such a bad team that it's going to tank his value a little bit in the short term. So I think he's a top 20 defenseman, but he's no longer that elite option on your team.
Yeah, I think he's probably still a top 12 defenseman, somewhere in there. Definitely outside of that top 5 where he was being drafted before. I think that he still holds value. And in a dynasty or keeper league, especially keeper, I still think it's worth holding on to him, because in 2 years' time, I think we're going to be sitting here talking about Dougie Hamilton being a top 5 defenseman again, as the Devils are more up and coming. So heading into our very last signing of the day, P.U. Sutter signs 2 years, at 3.25 per year. This is a good signing, I think, for Yzerman. He really can only score, which is fine for fantasy. He's a good goal scorer. Center probably will be on the second line, I think. I don't know or Detroit that well, but they've started to put together a good team with Vrana and Nedeljkovic and Ned and Suter and Larkin and Tuesday.
Bertuzzi.
I think that
Yeah.
there's a fair bit of talent now built on that team, and I think that Sutter, especially if he can get on that top power play, will actually hold value this year, and so is someone to watch.
Right. That brings us to the end of the opening day of free agent signings. That's going to be everything for our episode today. As we said before, there's going to be another one coming out right after this with the full crew of me, Ben, Azim, and Owen, talking about all the trades that happened and just looking at like our early season rankings based off of just early free agency. So stay tuned for that. Thank you everyone for listening, and make sure to meet us back here next week, same time, same place, when we talk about further news in the NHL, as well as our early season power rankings for teams. All right, everybody, have a good one.